Hey guys, tonight we're stepping through the fog and into one of the most extraordinary, misunderstood and unfairly treated neighborhoods in American history, 1880s San Francisco Chinatown. Not the postcard version, not the tourist-friendly lantern and dumpling version. I mean the real Chinatown, a packed, vibrant, fiercely resilient community of Chinese immigrants who built an entire world for themselves because America decided they weren't allowed to exist anywhere else. Before you get too cozy, tap like and subscribe, but only if you honestly enjoy these late-night history rambles. And thank you for suggesting this one. Your ideas always lead me somewhere interesting. Leave a comment with where you're listening from and the current time. I swear it's always 2 a.m. for someone. Now dim those lights, switch on a fan for that soft white noise, get comfortable, and maybe pull the blankets up because tonight's story has fog and lots of it. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered what it actually felt like to live in 1880s Chinatown? What did people eat when an entire city was trying to starve them out? How did you find a doctor when American hospitals wouldn't treat you? What did laundry day look like when doing laundry was literally one of the only jobs the government allowed you to have? Could you fall in love, raise a family, build a life in a neighborhood where politicians openly campaigned on the promise of making your existence illegal? How did you celebrate a holiday when your neighbors across the street wanted you deported? Did anyone ever just sit on a doorstep and wonder how a country that carved all men are created equal into its founding documents managed to look a Chinese immigrant in the eye and say, "Except you? And now, congratulations. You've just woken up in San Francisco. The year is 1882. You smell salt air, coal smoke, and something delicious frying in a wok 3 floors below. You don't speak much English. You have calloused hands, a few coins, and a letter from your family back in Guangdong province that you've read so many times the ink is fading. Outside your door, the most powerful country in the world just passed a law that says you don't belong here. Good luck. Let's rewind for a moment, because nobody just woke up one morning in Guangdong province and said, "You know what sounds fun? A 2-month ocean voyage to a country that hates me." Chinese immigrants came to California chasing the same dream every immigrant has ever chased: survival, opportunity, and maybe, just maybe, a life that didn't involve watching your children go hungry. They called it Gamsan, Gold Mountain. Word had spread back to southern China that there was gold in California, railroad work that paid actual money, and land so vast it seemed impossible that anyone could run out of room. What they didn't mention in the brochures, assuming brochures existed for grueling trans-Pacific voyages in the belly of a steamship, was that America had a very specific idea about who was welcome and who was useful, and the line between those two categories was about to get razor thin. Back in Guangdong province, life wasn't exactly a picnic either. Decades of war, famine, and political instability had hollowed out the countryside. The Taiping Rebellion alone had killed tens of millions of people. Let that number sit with you for a second. Tens of millions. Villages were starving, families were desperate. And then word arrived, passed from merchant to sailor to cousin to neighbour, that across the ocean there was a mountain made of gold. Not literally, of course, but close enough to make a starving farmer strap his belongings to his back and walk to the nearest port. The journey itself was a nightmare wrapped in a wooden hull. Most immigrants travelled in steerage, the cheapest class on the steamship, which was a polite way of saying you were packed below deck with 100 other men. Limited food, minimal ventilation, and seasickness so aggressive it felt like your stomach was trying to escape through your ears. The crossing took weeks. Some ships were better than others. Some were barely seaworthy. You ate rice and dried fish if you were lucky. You slept on wooden planks stacked like shelves, and the whole time you told yourself it would be worth it. Gold Mountain was waiting, and for a while, in the very early days, it almost was. Chinese immigrants arrived during the gold rush of the 1840s and 1850s, and found work in the mines, on the railroads, and in the growing towns that were springing up along the California coast like mushrooms after rain. They were tireless, resourceful, and willing to do the back-breaking labour that kept the American economy humming. The Central Pacific Railroad, one of the most ambitious engineering projects in American history, was built on the backs of Chinese workers who blasted tunnels through solid granite in the Sierra Nevada mountains, dangling from cliffs in wicker baskets with nothing but dynamite and extraordinary courage. Thousands died. The railroad got finished. America said thanks by pretending they didn't exist. Because here's the thing about Gold Mountain. The gold was for other people. Chinese miners were taxed at rates that white miners weren't. They were driven off the best claims by violence and legislation. When the railroad was completed in 1869, and thousands of Chinese workers were suddenly unemployed, they flooded into cities looking for work and walked straight into a wall of hostility that had been building for years. White workers, rather than blaming the corporations that exploited everyone's labour, blamed the Chinese for being willing to work for less. Politicians, sensing an opportunity that never gets old, fanned the flames. By the time you arrived in San Francisco in the 1880s, the dream of Gold Mountain had curdled into something much grimmer. You weren't walking into opportunity. You were walking into a trap, one built from racist laws, economic exploitation, and the uniquely American talent for welcoming your labour while despising your existence. Welcome to California. Please watch your step. The Golden Road is mostly mud. Imagine stepping off a ship after weeks at sea, your legs wobbly, your stomach in open rebellion, and the first thing you see isn't the golden paradise you were promised, but a customs hall full of people who look at you like you're a problem to be processed. San Francisco in the 1880s was booming. Railways, shipping, banking, real estate, and Chinese labour had helped build a staggering amount of it. But by the time you arrived, the welcome mat had been not just pulled away, but set on fire and stomped on. Anti-Chinese sentiment had been brewing for years, stoked by white labour unions who blamed Chinese workers for low wages instead of blaming the bosses who set them. Politicians discovered that scapegoating Chinese immigrants was an excellent way to win votes, and newspapers printed cartoons so racist they'd make your stomach turn faster than the steamship ever did. The moment you set foot on the dock, you were suspect. Immigration officials eyed you with open hostility. Paperwork was scrutinised, questioned, and sometimes conveniently lost. If you couldn't prove you were a merchant, a student, or the son of someone already legally in the country, you were turned around and sent back. Just like that. Weeks of misery at sea, your life savings spent on the ticket, and a man behind a desk who couldn't pronounce your name decided you weren't worth admitting. Those who did make it through customs stepped out into a city that was equal parts dazzling and terrifying. San Francisco in this era was a boomtown of wooden buildings, muddy streets, horse-drawn carriages, and ambition so thick you could smell it, along with the sewage, the coal smoke, and the fish markets along the waterfront. Cable cars were just beginning to crawl up the impossible hills. Wealthy neighbourhoods were sprouting mansions on Nob Hill. And somewhere in the middle of all that progress, tucked into a handful of cramped blocks, was the neighbourhood where you were expected to disappear. You didn't get a welcome packet. You didn't get directions. What you got, if you were fortunate, was a family connection. An uncle, a cousin, a fellow villager who had arrived before you and could point you toward a bed, a meal, and maybe a job. These networks were everything. They were the invisible scaffolding that held Chinatown together, built on trust, dialect, and the shared understanding that nobody else in this city was going to help you. If you didn't have a connection, you found a benevolent association, one of the community organisations that served as a combination welcome centre, employment agency, and mutual aid society. They would set you up, but it came with expectations. You owed loyalty. You owed a portion of your wages. You owed the community, because the community was the only thing standing between you and a city that would happily grind you into dust. Outside Chinatown, the hostility wasn't abstract. It was physical. Chinese immigrants were spat on, shoved, and had rocks thrown at them in broad daylight. Anti-coolie clubs organised rallies where white men whipped themselves into a fury about the supposed Chinese menace, as if a population of laundry workers and vegetable sellers posed an existential threat to a nation of 250 million. The word coolie itself was a slur, reducing an entire people to the sum of their cheap labour. You kept your head down, you walked quickly, you learned which streets were safe and which ones would earn you a beating, And you did all of this while simultaneously trying to figure out how to survive in a place that had spent years perfecting the art of making you feel unwelcome. San Francisco was a golden city, all right, but the gold, as usual, wasn't for you. In 1882, the United States government did something it had never done before in its history. It banned an entire ethnic group from immigrating. The Chinese Exclusion Act wasn't subtle, wasn't hidden behind legal jargon, and wasn't dressed up as anything other than what it was, a law that said, if you are Chinese, you're not welcome. It barred Chinese labourers from entering the country, prevented Chinese residents from becoming citizens, and created a legal framework that treated an entire people as permanent outsiders. For the Chinese immigrants already living in San Francisco, the act didn't just close the door behind them, it locked them inside a country that had openly declared them unwanted. You couldn't bring your wife over. You couldn't send for your children. You couldn't vote, own property in many areas, or testify in court against a white person. You were, in the eyes of American law, less than a full human being, and the law wasn't shy about saying so. The Exclusion Act didn't appear out of nowhere. It was the culmination of decades of anti-Chinese agitation that had been building since the gold rush. White labour groups like the Working Men's Party of California, led by an Irish immigrant named Dennis Kearney, yes, the irony is thick enough to choke on, had made the Chinese must go their rallying cry. Kearney gave fiery speeches on sandlots in San Francisco, whipping up crowds of unemployed white men who were angry about the economy and needed someone to blame who wasn't their boss. Chinese workers fit the bill perfectly. They looked different, spoke a different language, ate different food, and had the audacity to work harder for less money. Never mind that the reason they worked for less was that they had no bargaining power, no legal protections, and no other options. The narrative was set. Chinese immigrants were stealing jobs, driving down wages, and corrupting American morals. All they needed was a law to make it official. And so, Congress delivered. The Chinese Exclusion Act was passed with overwhelming bipartisan support, because if there's one thing that could unite 19th century Democrats and Republicans, it was agreeing that Chinese people didn't deserve the same rights as everyone else. President Chester Arthur signed it into law, and just like that, an entire population went from being tolerated labourers to being legally unwanted aliens. The act was initially supposed to last 10 years. It lasted 61. It was renewed in 1892, made permanent in 1902, and not fully repealed until 1943, and even then, only because China was an American ally in the Second World War, and the optics of banning your allies' citizens were getting a little awkward. For the people living in 1880s Chinatown, the act's effects were immediate and devastating. The population couldn't grow. Men who had planned to work for a few years and return home were now trapped, unable to leave without guaranteeing they could never come back. Families were shattered across an ocean. Women in China waited for husbands who would never return, raising children who would never meet their fathers, and inside Chinatown the community became frozen in a kind of suspended animation, a neighbourhood full of aging men, dwindling resources, and the dawning realisation that Gold Mountain was not a temporary stop. It was a cage. The Exclusion Act told Chinese immigrants exactly what America thought of them, and the worst part was, it would take more than half a century for the country to even pretend to change its mind. Chinatown in the 1880s wasn't a sprawling district. It was a compressed, tightly packed rectangle of roughly 8 blocks in the heart of San Francisco, bordered by streets that might as well have been walls. Chinese immigrants didn't choose to cram themselves into this tiny sliver of the city because they loved close quarters. They were forced there. Discriminatory housing laws, racist landlords, and the constant threat of violence meant that stepping outside Chinatown's unofficial borders was an invitation for trouble. So they built everything they needed right where they were. Within those 8 blocks you could find grocery stores, herbalists, temples, barbershops, restaurants, boarding houses, and tailors. It was an entire civilization compressed into a space roughly the size of a modern shopping mall parking lot. And somehow, against every odds stacked against them, it worked. Walk down any street in Chinatown and your senses would be under full assault. The narrow lanes, some barely wide enough for two people to pass without brushing shoulders, were hung with wooden signs painted in Chinese characters, advertising everything from dried goods to fortune-telling. The smell was layered and complex. Roasting duck fat from a kitchen on your left, the sharp medicinal bite of an herbal shop on your right, and beneath it all, the persistent damp fog that rolled in off the bay every evening like a cold, wet blanket that never quite dried out. Wooden balconies jutted out over the streets, draped with laundry, potted plants, and the occasional bird cage, because even in exile people wanted to hear something sing. The infrastructure was makeshift and brilliant. Chinatown had its own system for nearly everything the city refused to provide. There were Chinese-language newspapers, community bulletin boards, employment brokers, and informal banks. There were cobblers who fixed shoes, barbers who maintained queues, and cooks who could feed 30 men from a kitchen the size of a closet. It was a fully functioning society operating inside a city that pretended it didn't exist, or worse, wished it would disappear. The streets had their own rhythms. Early mornings belonged to merchants hauling crates of vegetables and barrels of dried fish. Midday was for business, laundry pickups, deliveries, the steady hum of commerce. Evenings brought the social hours, when men gathered in association halls, tea houses, and yes, the occasional gambling room, because when your entire existence is an exercise in endurance, you're entitled to a little recreation. What made those 8 blocks extraordinary wasn't just their density, it was their defiance. Every shop that opened, every temple that held a service, every child who attended a makeshift school was a small act of resistance against a system designed to erase Chinese presence from American life. The city of San Francisco wanted Chinatown gone. Politicians proposed relocating it, demolishing it, and burning it down, the last of which they would eventually get their wish for in 1906, though not on their terms. But in the 1880s, Chinatown held firm. It was crowded, it was poor, it smelled like 100 competing dinners, and it was alive. 8 blocks doesn't sound like much, but when you build a world inside a prison, every square foot becomes sacred. And the people of Chinatown treated it that way, not because they had chosen this life, but because they refused to let the life that was forced on them be the end of their story. Housing in Chinatown wasn't housing in any way you'd recognise today. It was survival architecture, wooden tenements, many of them built hastily and maintained poorly by white landlords, who charged exorbitant rent for the privilege of squalor, rose 3 and 4 stories above the narrow streets. Inside, rooms meant for 1 or 2 people held 6, 8, sometimes 12. Bunk beds stacked to the ceiling, shifts of workers rotating through the same mattress like a 24-hour sleep relay. The air was thick, the walls were thin, and privacy was a concept that existed only in the letters you wrote home, where you probably didn't mention any of this because your family was counting on you to be succeeding in Gold Mountain, not sleeping in a room with 11 strangers and a persistent leak in the ceiling. The buildings themselves were fire hazards held together by optimism and old nails. Narrow staircases creaked under the weight of daily foot traffic. Hallways were dark even at noon because windows, where they existed, were tiny and often blocked by the building next door, which stood close enough to share a handshake. Ventilation was a generous word for what actually happened inside these structures, which was essentially nothing. Air came in through cracks in the walls, which also let in cold, fog, rats, and the neighbours' cooking smoke. You got used to it, or you didn't, but either way you stayed, because where else were you going to go? The landlords, almost universally white, had discovered a beautiful business model. Buy a building in Chinatown, subdivide every room into tiny compartments, charge each occupant separately, and never invest a single dollar in maintenance. It was pure profit extracted from people who had no alternatives. If you complained, the landlord would laugh, raise the rent, or both. If you refused to pay, you'd be out on the street in a neighbourhood where every room was already taken. There was no housing authority to appeal to, no tenant protections worth the paper they weren't printed on, and no political will to change any of it. The rent was highway robbery. Chinese tenants in Chinatown paid more per square foot than residents in many of San Francisco's wealthier districts. despite living in conditions that would have been considered criminal anywhere else. It was a tax on existing, a surcharge for being Chinese in a city that tolerated your labour but despised your presence. Inside these cramped rooms, people created order from chaos. Personal belongings were stored in small trunks tucked under bunks. Clothes hung from hooks on the walls or from lines strung across the ceiling. A small altar in the corner, sometimes just a shelf with a stick of incense and a photograph, served as a connection to home and to something greater than the four sagging walls around you. Men who worked opposite shifts rarely saw each other, trading the same bed like a warm baton in a relay race of exhaustion. Sleep was performed in fragments, interrupted by coughing, snoring, the shuffle of feet coming and going at all hours, and the ever-present sounds of a neighbourhood that never fully went quiet. And yet, these rooms were more than just places to collapse. They were where friendships were forged over shared meals of rice and salted vegetables eaten cross-legged on a bunk. They were where news from home was read aloud by the one man in the room who could read well. They were where someone might quietly lend you money when you were short on rent, asking for nothing in return except the understanding that you'd do the same when his turn came. 12 people in a room meant for two isn't comfortable, but it's survivable, especially when every single one of those 12 people understands exactly what you're going through, because they're going through it too. Let's talk about food, because even in a neighbourhood under siege, people have to eat. And what Chinese immigrants managed to do with food in 1880s Chinatown was nothing short of miraculous. Discriminatory laws and hostile vendors meant that sourcing ingredients wasn't as simple as strolling to the nearest market. Many white-owned shops refused to serve Chinese customers, and even when they did, the prices were inflated to the point of cruelty. So Chinatown built its own food network. Merchants imported dried goods from China, mushrooms, tofu, preserved vegetables, soy sauce, rice, creating supply chains that stretched across the Pacific Ocean. Local Chinese farmers who had been pushed out of mining and railroad work cultivated small plots outside the city, growing bok choy, long beans, and other vegetables that you absolutely could not find in any American grocery store at the time. The kitchens of Chinatown were miracles of efficiency and improvisation. Woks, those beautiful, versatile, perfectly engineered cooking vessels, were the centerpiece. A single wok over a hot flame could produce stir-fried vegetables, steamed fish, fried noodles, and soup, often in the same evening. Cooking fuel was expensive, so speed mattered. The wok's design, with its thin metal and curved shape, heated fast and cooked faster. A skilled cook could feed a dozen men in 20 minutes with a wok, a cleaver, and whatever ingredients the day's market run had produced. It was the original fast food, centuries before anyone stuck a burger under a heat lamp. Rice was the foundation of everything. It was breakfast, lunch, dinner, and the thing that made all the other things possible. A man could survive on rice and a handful of salted vegetables when money was tight, which it almost always was. Congee, a thick rice porridge, was the breakfast of choice, cheap, filling, warming, and infinitely customizable. Drop in a preserved egg, a few slices of ginger, some dried pork floss, and you had a meal that stuck to your ribs and cost next to nothing. It wasn't glamorous, it was genius. The restaurants that began emerging in Chinatown served dual purposes. For Chinese residents, they were communal dining halls where men who didn't have kitchens, which was most of them, could get a hot meal at a reasonable price. Long communal tables, steaming bowls of noodle soup, plates of stir-fried greens with oyster sauce, and pots of tea that never seemed to empty. These weren't fancy establishments. They were functional, loud, packed, and essential. But the restaurants also served another purpose entirely. They were one of the few Chinatown institutions that attracted white customers. Adventurous San Franciscans, drawn by curiosity or genuine appetite, began venturing into Chinatown for meals, and what they found surprised them. The food was extraordinary. Flavors they had never encountered, textures they couldn't name, and a sophistication of preparation that put most American cooking of the era to shame, which, to be fair, wasn't difficult when the competition was boiled meat and potatoes. This accidental cultural bridge built over bowls of chow mein and cups of jasmine tea, would eventually become one of Chinese immigrants' most lasting contributions to American life. But in the 1880s, that future was still far off. For now, food in Chinatown was about survival first and everything else second. You ate what you could afford. You shared what you had. You stretched a chicken into 3 meals and made the bones into broth for a 4th. And if you managed to sit down at the end of an 18-hour day to a bowl of hot rice with a little soy sauce and a scrap of something green, you counted yourself lucky, because in Gold Mountain, even a full stomach was a small victory against a city that would have been perfectly happy to see you starve. If there was one job that defined Chinese labour in 1880s San Francisco, it was laundry. Not because Chinese immigrants had some special affinity for washing clothes. That's a stereotype with racist roots. But because discriminatory laws had systematically locked them out of nearly every other industry. You couldn't work in most factories. You couldn't join white labour unions. You couldn't practice law, medicine, or most trades. But you could wash clothes, because white Americans considered it beneath them. So Chinese immigrants took the work nobody else wanted and turned it into an economic backbone. Laundries popped up across the city, small storefront operations where men worked 14, 16, sometimes 18 hours a day over steaming tubs of boiling water, scrubbing, pressing, and folding the shirts of people who wouldn't sit next to them on a streetcar. The work was brutal in a way that's hard to fully appreciate from a modern perspective. There were no washing machines, no electric dryers, no steam presses that did the hard part for you. Everything was done by hand. You heated water over a wood or coal fire, poured it into massive tubs and scrubbed every garment individually using soap, a washboard, and your own rapidly deteriorating hands. The soap was harsh, the water scalding, and by the end of a shift your fingers were raw, cracked, and bleeding. Your back ached from hunching over washtubs for hours. Your lungs burned from the constant steam, and the ironing done with heavy metal flat irons heated on a stove was an exercise in precision and endurance, pressing perfectly crisp creases into other people's shirts, while your own shirt stuck to your back with sweat. A typical Chinese laundry was a one-room operation. The front served as a counter where customers dropped off and picked up their bundles. The back was the workshop, a dense, humid, almost unbearable space filled with tubs, drying lines strung wall to wall, ironing boards and stacks of sorted laundry that threatened to topple at any moment. Many laundry operators lived in the same room where they worked, sleeping on a narrow cot pushed into the corner after the last shirt was folded. The line between workplace and home didn't exist because there was no line. There was just the laundry, all day, every day, 7 days a week. And the pay? Modest. Enough to survive, enough to send a little home, but never enough to escape. Chinese laundry owners charged competitive rates because they had to. Undercutting white businesses was sometimes the only way to attract customers, which of course fueled more resentment from white competitors who accused Chinese laundries of unfair practices, as if working yourself to the bone for pennies was some kind of cunning strategy rather than a desperate last resort. The city noticed, not with admiration, but with hostility. San Francisco passed a series of ordinances specifically designed to harass and shut down Chinese laundries. The most notorious required laundries operating in wooden buildings to obtain special permits that were granted to white applicants and denied to Chinese ones with a consistency that was almost impressive in its brazenness. This was the law that Yik Wo would eventually challenge all the way to the Supreme Court, but that fight was still coming. In the meantime, Chinese laundry operators did what they always did, kept their heads down, heated the water, scrubbed the shirts, and endured. Because the laundry wasn't just a business, it was a lifeline, a way to exist in a city that offered you almost nothing else. And if the price of existence was 18 hours a day in a steam-filled room with cracked hands and an aching spine, well, you paid it. What other choice did you have? When you got sick in 1880s Chinatown, you didn't go to a hospital. You couldn't. Most American hospitals either refused to treat Chinese patients or offered care so dismissive and hostile that it barely qualified as medicine. So Chinatown had its own healers, and they'd been practicing their craft for a few thousand years longer than anything the American medical establishment had to offer. Traditional Chinese medicine practitioners set up shop in small rooms along Chinatown's narrow streets, their walls lined with hundreds of wooden drawers, each one filled with dried herbs, roots, bark, minerals, and ingredients that would make a modern pharmacist squint very hard. Ginseng, licorice root, chrysanthemum, astragalus. These weren't folk remedies. They were part of a sophisticated medical system with centuries of documented use. A visit to a Chinatown herbalist was an experience that bore almost no resemblance to what was happening in American doctors' offices at the time. For context, mainstream American medicine in the 1880s was still figuring out germ theory. Doctors were only recently convinced that washing their hands before surgery was a good idea. Bloodletting was still practiced. Mercury was prescribed for just about everything, and the average American physician's diagnostic toolkit consisted largely of looking at you, shrugging, and prescribing something that might or might not make things worse. Chinese herbalists, by contrast, operated within a framework of diagnosis that involved reading your pulse at multiple points on both wrists, examining your tongue, asking detailed questions about your sleep, your appetite, your emotions, and your digestion, and then crafting a customized herbal formula designed to address not just your symptoms but the underlying imbalance causing them. It was holistic medicine in the truest sense, practiced centuries before the word holistic became a marketing buzzword on expensive juice bottles. The herbal pharmacy itself was a marvel. Those walls of tiny wooden drawers, each one labelled in careful brushstrokes, contained hundreds of individual ingredients. A single prescription might combine 8, 10, or 15 different herbs, each chosen for a specific purpose. One to clear heat, one to move stagnation, one to strengthen the kidneys, one to calm the spirit. The herbalist would measure out each ingredient with practiced hands, wrap the bundle in paper, and send you home with instructions to boil it into a tea. And yes, the tea tasted terrible, absolutely, categorically awful, the kind of bitter, earthy, vaguely swamp-like brew that made you question whether the cure was worse than the disease. But people drank it because it worked. Maybe not always, and maybe not for everything, but often enough that Chinatown's herbalists stayed busy from morning to night. Beyond herbal medicine, Chinatown's healthcare network included acupuncturists, bone setters, and practitioners of tui ne, a form of therapeutic massage. Acupuncture, which involved inserting thin needles into specific points along the body's energy pathways, was viewed by white San Franciscans with a mixture of horror and fascination. To the Chinese community, it was simply medicine. You had a headache, someone put a needle in your hand, and the headache went away. You didn't need to understand the theory to appreciate the results. The cruel irony of all this was that while San Francisco's health inspectors were busy condemning Chinatown as a hotbed of disease, the neighborhood's medical practitioners were quietly providing care that was, in many respects, more thoughtful and less dangerous than what mainstream American medicine had to offer. But acknowledging that would have required admitting that Chinese immigrants brought something valuable to America besides cheap labor, and the 1880s weren't quite ready for that conversation. In a neighborhood where the outside world treated you as less than human, the temples of Chinatown were something else entirely. They were sanctuary, community center, and spiritual anchor all rolled into one incense-scented room. Tucked into the upper floors of narrow buildings, accessible by steep, creaking staircases, these temples were modest by the standards of the grand Buddhist and Taoist complexes back in China. But they were everything. The Tin Hao Temple, one of the oldest in Chinatown, sat high above the street, dedicated to Mazu, the goddess of the sea and protector of travellers. Considering that nearly every person in Chinatown had survived a harrowing ocean crossing to get there, her presence made a particular kind of sense. People came to burn incense, offer fruit and tea, consult fortune sticks, and simply sit in a space where they were not being judged, legislated against, or told to go home. The climb to the temple was part of the experience. You'd push through a narrow doorway at street level, often unmarked or marked only with a few Chinese characters that meant nothing to the white tourists who occasionally wandered the neighborhood, gawking at the exotic locals. Then came the stairs, steep, wooden, worn smooth by decades of feet. The air changed as you climbed. Street level smelled like fish markets and coal smoke. By the second floor, you caught the first sweet drift of sandalwood incense. By the time you reached the temple itself, the noise of the street had faded to a murmur, replaced by a stillness that felt almost physical, like stepping through a curtain into another world. The temple rooms were small, warm, and thick with smoke from burning incense and joss paper. Red and gold dominated, the colours of luck, prosperity, and divine blessing. Altars were crowded with offerings: oranges, cups of tea, plates of sticky rice, small dishes of roasted pork. Paper lanterns hung from the ceiling, casting a soft amber glow that made everything feel slightly unreal, slightly sacred, slightly removed from the grinding hardship of daily life in Chinatown. Statues of deities gazed down with serene painted faces. Mazu, of course, held the place of honour, but she wasn't alone. Guan Yu, the god of war and righteousness, was popular among men who valued loyalty and brotherhood. Guan Yin, the goddess of mercy, drew those who needed compassion in a world that offered very little. Worship here wasn't the rigid, pew-sitting, hymn-singing affair that white San Francisco practiced on Sunday mornings. It was personal, practical, and deeply flexible. You came when you needed to. You lit incense, bowed 3 times, and made your request. Health for a sick friend, protection for a family member back in China, luck in tomorrow's business dealings, or simply the strength to get through another week. You shook a bamboo cylinder full of fortune sticks until one fell out, then matched the numbered stick to a printed fortune, which a temple attendant would interpret for you. Some fortunes were encouraging, some were not. Either way, you accepted them with a nod and moved on, because faith in Chinatown wasn't about certainty. It was about having somewhere to put your hope when the rest of the world gave you nowhere else. The temples also served as informal community spaces. Elders gathered there to talk, to share news, and to maintain the cultural traditions that were in constant danger of erosion. In a neighbourhood where children were few and connections to China were growing more tenuous with each passing year, the temples were one of the few places where the old ways survived intact. The rituals, the prayers, the offerings, they were threads connecting 1880s San Francisco to a homeland that some residents would never see again. And those threads mattered. They were proof that no matter how many laws a government passed, no matter how many doors a society slammed shut, it could not legislate away the human need for the sacred, the beautiful, and the hopeful. The temple at the top of the stairs wasn't grand, but it was enough, and sometimes enough is everything. Language in 1880s. Chinatown was a daily negotiation between survival and identity. Most Chinese immigrants spoke Cantonese, specifically the Tosanese dialect common in the Guangdong province region, where the majority of them came from. English, when they learned it, was picked up in fragments, enough to conduct business, navigate a hostile legal system, and respond to the men who shouted slurs at them on the street without fully understanding that ignoring an insult sometimes required understanding it first. Within Chinatown, Cantonese was the language of home, of comfort, of everything that mattered. Shopkeepers haggled in it, herbalists diagnosed in it, mothers scolded children in it, and old men argued over chess games in it. But the moment you stepped outside those 8 blocks, you entered a world that spoke a language designed, it seemed, to exclude you from every conversation that mattered. English was not a friendly language to learn under the best of circumstances, and these were decidedly not the best of circumstances. There were no ESL classes, no language apps, no patient tutors guiding you through verb conjugations over coffee. You learned English the way you learned everything else in Chinatown, by necessity, by observation, and by making mistakes in front of people who were not inclined to be understanding about it. You picked up words at the laundry counter. Shirt. Tomorrow. $2. You absorbed phrases from customers who spoke slowly if you were lucky, and mockingly if you were not. You learned legal terminology the hard way, from courtroom proceedings and police encounters, where understanding the difference between 2 English words might mean the difference between walking free and spending a night in a cell. The language barrier was weaponized against Chinese immigrants constantly. Courts, Government offices and hospitals operated exclusively in English, which meant that navigating any official institution required either bringing along someone who could translate or simply hoping for the best. And hoping for the best in a legal system that had already decided you were less than human was a strategy with a very low success rate. Contracts were signed by people who couldn't fully read them. Rights were waived by people who didn't understand they had them. And unscrupulous landlords, employers, and officials exploited the language gap with the same enthusiasm they applied to every other form of exploitation. Within Chinatown, a small class of bilingual intermediaries became invaluable. These were men, and occasionally women, who had been in the country long enough to speak English with confidence. They served as translators, interpreters, and unofficial advocates, bridging the gap between two worlds that had no interest in meeting each other halfway. They accompanied workers to court. They helped merchants negotiate with white suppliers. They translated threatening letters from city officials into Cantonese so that the community could understand exactly how it was being targeted this week. These bilingual individuals occupied a strange in-between space, too American for the old men who clung to tradition, too Chinese for the white institutions they navigated. They belonged to both worlds and neither, a duality that would define the Chinese-American experience for generations to come. For the children who grew up in Chinatown, assuming there were enough children to constitute a growing up, language was even more complicated. They spoke Cantonese at home and English at school, assuming they attended school, which many couldn't. They became translators for their own parents at ages when most kids were still figuring out how to tie their shoes. A 7-year-old explaining a tax notice to a father who had built railroads with his bare hands. That was the bilingual reality of Chinatown. Not glamorous, not romantic, just necessary. Language in 1880s. Chinatown wasn't just about communication. It was about power, and the people who controlled the language controlled the power. English was the key to the outside world, and the outside world made sure that key was as hard to obtain as possible. So Chinese immigrants did what they always did. They adapted, they improvised, and they kept talking in whatever language would get them through the day, since the American government had made it abundantly clear that Chinese immigrants would receive no protection, no services, and no justice from official channels. Chinatown did what any sensible community under siege would do. It built its own government, the Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association, known commonly as the Six Companies, became the de facto ruling body of Chinatown. It wasn't a government in the traditional sense. There were no elections, no constitution, no city hall with a flag out front. But it functioned as one. The Six Companies mediated disputes, organised community defence, negotiated with white city officials, funded legal challenges against discriminatory laws, and provided social services that the city of San Francisco flatly refused to offer. If you arrived in Chinatown with nothing, the Six Companies helped you find housing and work. If you died, they made sure your bones were shipped back to China for proper burial, because even in death, going home mattered. The Six Companies weren't a single organisation, but a coalition of district associations, each one representing immigrants from a specific region of Guangdong province. When you arrived in San Francisco, you were expected to register with the association that corresponded to your home district. This wasn't optional. The association was your safety net, your employment agency, your legal advocate, and your social insurance policy all wrapped into one. In return, you paid dues and owed loyalty. The system wasn't perfect. It could be rigid, hierarchical, and sometimes exploitative, but compared to the alternative, which was facing the full weight of American racism completely alone, it was a lifeline that no one could afford to refuse. The leaders of the Six Companies were typically the wealthiest and most established merchants in Chinatown. They were men who had been in the country long enough to understand how American power worked, who spoke enough English to negotiate with white officials, and who had accumulated enough resources to fund legal battles that individual workers could never afford. They hired white lawyers, good ones, to challenge discriminatory ordinances in court. They wrote letters to politicians, they organised delegations to Sacramento and Washington, and when those polite channels failed, which they frequently did, they used economic leverage, community solidarity, and sheer stubborn persistence to protect their people. The Six Companies also served as Chinatown's internal justice system. When disputes arose over debts, business deals, property, or personal grievances, they were brought before the association leaders for mediation. Going to the American courts was pointless for most Chinese residents, since their testimony could be dismissed, their rights were limited, and the system was openly hostile. The 6 companies offered an alternative, imperfect, yes, and sometimes heavy-handed, but at least it was a system that recognized your humanity and operated in a language you could understand. One of the 6 companies' most important functions was managing the return of remains. For Chinese immigrants, being buried in a foreign land was a source of deep spiritual distress. The belief that one's bones should rest in ancestral soil was not a casual preference. It was a profound cultural obligation. The 6 companies organised the exhumation, cleaning and shipping of bones back to China, a process that was logistically complex, emotionally charged and staggeringly expensive. They funded it through community dues and donations, because ensuring that a man who had spent his life working in a country that despised him could at least return home in death was considered a sacred responsibility, not a luxury. The 6 companies weren't without their critics. Some accused them of being too controlling, of extracting too much from workers who were already stretched thin, of consolidating power among a merchant elite that didn't always have the labourer's best interest at heart. These criticisms had merit, but in a neighbourhood where the only alternative to self-governance was no governance at all, the 6 companies represented something essential. Proof that a community denied every official protection could still organise, still fight, and still take care of its own. They were Chinatown's spine, and without them, the neighbourhood might not have survived long enough to become history. Let's talk about hair, because in 1880s Chinatown, your hairstyle wasn't just a fashion choice, it was a political statement, a cultural identity marker, and occasionally a target for violence. Most Chinese men in this era wore the queue, a long braided ponytail that hung down the back, with the front of the head shaved. Under the Qing dynasty, the queue was mandatory. Refusing to wear one was an act of treason punishable by death, so even thousands of miles from China the queue remained. But in San Francisco, it also made you a walking target. White mobs sometimes grabbed queues in the street as a form of humiliation. In 1876, the San Francisco Board of Supervisors actually passed the Cubic Air Ordinance and the Q Ordinance, laws designed specifically to harass Chinese residents. The Q Ordinance mandated that any man jailed would have his hair cut to within 1 inch of his scalp, a rule aimed squarely at Chinese men and their queues. Think about what that means for a moment. A government passed a law specifically to cut your hair as punishment. Not because long hair posed a safety risk, not because it violated any rational regulation, but because they knew that your braid meant something to you, something cultural, something spiritual, something connected to your identity and your homeland, and they wanted to take it from you. The cruelty wasn't incidental, it was the point. Cutting a man's queue wasn't just a haircut, it was an act of cultural violence, a message that said, even the things you carry on your body aren't safe from us. The barbershops of Chinatown understood all of this. They were more than places to get a trim, they were cultural institutions. A barbershop visit meant sitting in a chair while a skilled barber maintained your queue with the same care and precision that his counterpart back in Guangdong province would have. The front of the head was shaved clean, the long hair at the back was brushed, oiled and braided into a neat tight plait. The process was ritualistic, almost meditative. For many men, it was one of the few moments in their week when someone touched them gently, when the world slowed down enough to feel almost normal. The barbershop was also one of Chinatown's most reliable gossip networks. Men sat waiting their turn and talked about work, about the latest discriminatory ordinance, about news from home, about which merchant was cheating on his prices, about whose cousin had just arrived from China. Information flowed through barbershops the way it flows through social media today, except slower, more personal, and accompanied by the steady snip of scissors and the warm scent of hair oil. If you wanted to know what was happening in Chinatown, you didn't read a newspaper, you went to the barber. The queue itself occupied a complicated emotional space for many Chinese men in America. Some wore it with pride, a visible connection to their heritage, and a defiance against a country that wanted them to assimilate or disappear. Others resented it, seeing it as a mark of submission to the Qing dynasty that had done little to protect its overseas citizens from foreign persecution. A few quietly cut their cues off in private acts of rebellion, against China, against America, against everyone who seemed to have an opinion about what should grow out of their heads. But for most, the cue remained. Because tradition and identity aren't things you discard easily, especially when they're all you have left of a home you might never see again. The barbershop kept it all together, literally and figuratively. It maintained the braid, maintained the tradition, and maintained a small pocket of normalcy in a life that was anything but. And every time a man walked out with his queue freshly oiled and neatly braided, it was a quiet declaration that no ordinance, no mob, and no amount of hostility could strip away who he was. Not today, anyway. If you were a child in 1880s Chinatown, your childhood looked nothing like what any modern kid would recognise. For starters, there weren't many children around at all. The Chinese Exclusion Act and earlier discriminatory immigration policies had created a brutally lopsided population. Chinatown was overwhelmingly male. Wives, mothers, and daughters had largely been prevented from immigrating, which meant that the few children who did exist in Chinatown were rare, precious, and grew up fast. Those children who were there navigated a world that demanded adult responsibilities at impossibly young ages. You helped in the family business before school, if there was school. You translated for parents and elders who spoke no English, turning 7-year-olds into unofficial diplomats navigating a legal system designed to crush them. The numbers tell a grim story. By the 1880s, the ratio of men to women in Chinatown was staggeringly imbalanced. Some estimates suggest as high as 20-1. The Page Act of 1875 had effectively barred Chinese women from immigrating by classifying nearly all of them as suspected prostitutes, a breathtakingly racist presumption that accomplished its real goal, preventing Chinese families from forming on American soil. If there were no families, the thinking went, the Chinese would eventually die out or go home. It was demographic warfare disguised as moral legislation, and it worked exactly as intended. The few women who were in Chinatown were merchants' wives, a small number who had arrived before the restrictions tightened, and women trapped in circumstances far worse. But that's a story heavy enough to deserve its own telling. The children who did grow up in Chinatown inhabited two worlds simultaneously, and neither one fit them properly. At home, they were Chinese. They spoke Cantonese with their parents. They observed traditional customs and holidays. They learned to respect elders, to honour ancestors, and to understand that the money their father earned belonged not just to the family in San Francisco, but to the family back in Guangdong. But the moment they stepped outside, they were American, or at least they were expected to navigate an American world that didn't particularly want them either. School, for those who attended, was conducted in English. Some Chinese children went to public schools where they were the only non-white faces in the room. Others attended mission schools run by Christian organizations that offered education in exchange for religious instruction, a trade-off that many Chinese families accepted pragmatically. You needed your child to learn English. If that came with a side of Bible study, so be it. Survival doesn't have the luxury of being picky. The most defining feature of childhood in Chinatown was translation, not just of language but of entire worlds. A child might spend the morning explaining a landlord's eviction notice to a father who couldn't read English, the afternoon reciting multiplication tables in a classroom full of white children, and the evening helping chop vegetables in the back of a restaurant kitchen. There was no time for play in the way that word is usually understood. Play was what happened in the cracks between obligations, a stolen game of marbles in an alley, a few minutes of laughter before someone called you back to work. And yet, for all the hardship, these children developed something remarkable, a resilience and adaptability that would define the Chinese-American experience for the next century. They learned to code switch between languages and cultures before the term existed. They learned to read rooms, to sense hostility, to navigate spaces that weren't designed for them. They grew up bilingual, bicultural, and profoundly tough, not because anyone planned it that way, but because Chinatown in the 1880s didn't leave room for anything else. The children of Chinatown didn't have childhoods in the traditional sense. What they had was preparation, relentless and unforgiving, for a world that would spend decades deciding whether to accept them. And when that world finally grudgingly began to open its doors, those children and their children after them were ready. Now every historical account of 1880s, Chinatown, written by a white journalist at the time, made sure to mention gambling, usually in a tone that suggested Chinese immigrants had invented sin itself. The reality, as usual, was more complicated and more human. Yes, gambling existed in Chinatown. Fan-tan tables, lottery games and card rooms operated in basements and back rooms throughout the neighbourhood. But here's what those breathless newspaper exposés never bothered to mention. Gambling dens were one of the only forms of recreation available to a population of men who worked 16-hour days, couldn't go to most public parks, weren't welcome in theatres or saloons, and had no families to go home to. These weren't dens of moral collapse. They were the social clubs of a community that had been denied every other social outlet. Fan-tan was the most popular game, and it was elegantly simple. A dealer placed a pile of buttons, coins, or small objects under a cup, then removed them 4 at a time until 1, 2, 3, or 4 remained. You bet on the final number. That was it. No complicated rules, no elaborate strategy. Just a guess, a hope, and the brief, electric thrill of possibility in a life that offered very little of either. The game moved fast, the stakes were usually small, and the atmosphere was thick with cigarette smoke, Cantonese chatter, and the kind of focused attention that comes from men who have very few pleasures and intend to enjoy this one fully. Lottery games were also widespread. The Chinese lottery, which white San Franciscans borrowed, rebranded and eventually turned into the game of Keno, involved selecting characters from a grid and waiting for the results. Tickets were cheap, winnings were modest, but the act of playing, of choosing your numbers, of imagining what you'd do with a windfall, of having something to look forward to besides another day of scrubbing shirts, was its own reward. The lottery gave men a reason to gather, a topic of conversation, and a tiny flicker of hope in an otherwise relentlessly grey existence. White newspapers, of course, portrayed all of this as evidence of Chinese moral weakness. They ran lurid stories about gambling dens as though they were reporting on the gates of hell itself, conveniently ignoring the fact that white San Francisco had its own thriving gambling scene, horse racing, card rooms, saloon betting, that operated with far less scrutiny and far more social acceptance. The double standard was breathtaking. When white men gambled, it was recreation. When Chinese men gambled, it was depravity. This wasn't journalism, it was propaganda, designed to justify the ongoing persecution of a community that was already being squeezed from every direction. Were there problems? Of course. Some men gambled more than they could afford, sending less money home than they should have, falling into debt with operators who weren't always forgiving about late payments. Addiction is real, and it doesn't discriminate by ethnicity. But framing gambling as a uniquely Chinese vice, as the newspapers did, was a deliberate distortion. It stripped away context, erased the systemic conditions that made gambling one of the only available escapes, and replaced understanding with contempt. The gambling dens of Chinatown were symptoms, not causes. They existed because a community of isolated, overworked, lonely men needed somewhere to go and something to do that wasn't work, sleep, or staring at the walls of a room shared with 11 other men. They were imperfect, sometimes harmful, and entirely human. And if the city of San Francisco had spent half as much energy providing Chinese immigrants with parks, libraries, and social services as it did condemning them for finding their own ways to cope, those dens might never have been necessary in the first place. But that would have required treating Chinese immigrants like people, and in the 1880s that was asking far too much. Let's address the elephant in the room, or more accurately the pipe in the room, because no discussion of 1880s Chinatown is complete without talking about opium, and no discussion of opium is complete without talking about who actually created the problem. White newspapers of the era painted Chinatown's opium use as evidence of Chinese moral depravity, a convenient narrative that ignored one spectacular detail. It was the British Empire that had forced opium into China in the first place. The Opium Wars of the 1840s and 1860s were fought specifically because Britain wanted to keep selling opium to Chinese people for profit. And when the Chinese government tried to stop it, Britain went to war. Twice. So when Chinese immigrants arrived in California carrying habits that British imperialism had deliberately cultivated, American society pointed at them and said, "Look how depraved they are." The hypocrisy was staggering. Let's back up and spell this out clearly because it matters. In the early 19th century, the British East India Company was growing opium in India and shipping it to China in massive quantities. The Chinese government, correctly recognizing that opium was destroying its population, banned the drug and tried to enforce the prohibition. Britain's response was to send warships, crush China's military, and force open Chinese ports to continued opium trade through the Treaty of Nanking and subsequent agreements. This wasn't a footnote in history. It was one of the most cynical acts of state-sponsored drug dealing the world has ever seen. British profits soared, Chinese addiction soared with them, and the social consequences, broken families, impoverished villages, shattered health, rippled through Chinese society for generations. So when Chinese immigrants in San Francisco used opium, they weren't indulging in some exotic cultural vice. They were carrying the scars of an addiction that had been imposed on their homeland by a foreign empire for profit. The men who smoked in Chinatown's opium dens were often the same men who worked 18-hour days, lived in rooms with a dozen strangers, and had no families, no recreation, and no realistic prospect of the situation improving. Opium offered a few hours of relief from a life that was, by any honest measure, crushingly difficult. Was it harmful? Absolutely. Was it the result of moral weakness? That's a convenient story for people who didn't want to examine their own role in creating the conditions that made it appealing. The opium dens themselves were small, dimly lit rooms, usually in basements or back alleys, where men reclined on wooden platforms and smoked from long-stemmed pipes. The air was sweet and heavy. The atmosphere was quiet. Opium dens were not rowdy places. They were retreats, sad and slow, where men chased a temporary numbness that the rest of their lives couldn't provide. White visitors sometimes came to Chinatown specifically to see the opium dens, treating them as tourist attractions, proof of Chinese otherness to be gawked at and written about in shocked, titillated prose. The same white society that had benefited enormously from the opium trade now used its consequences as a weapon against the very people it had victimized. In 1875, San Francisco passed one of the first anti-opium ordinances in the country, targeting Chinatown specifically. The law didn't ban opium entirely. White pharmacies still sold opium-based products like laudanum over the counter to white customers without controversy. What it banned was the Chinese method of smoking opium, because the goal was never public health. The goal was another tool to harass, fine, arrest and control the Chinese population. The opium story of 1880s Chinatown is not a story about Chinese vice. It's a story about imperial exploitation, racist double standards, and a community that was blamed for wounds it didn't inflict on itself. And the fact that this particular piece of context was conveniently left out of every newspaper article, political speech, and legislative debate of the era tells you everything you need to know about who was really controlling the narrative. If you wanted to know what 1880s Chinatown was really like, the absolute last place you should have looked was a San Francisco newspaper. The city's press didn't just report on Chinatown, it waged a campaign against it. Papers like the San Francisco Chronicle ran lurid, sensationalized stories describing Chinatown as a cesspool of vice, disease, and alien menace. Headlines screamed about opium dens, secret tunnels, and mysterious crimes, painting a picture designed to terrify white readers and justify every discriminatory law on the books. The journalists who wrote these stories rarely spoke to Chinese residents. They didn't have to. The goal wasn't accuracy, it was ammunition. Every article was another brick in the wall of public opinion that kept Chinese immigrants trapped, hated, and politically powerless. The formula was remarkably consistent. Take a real element of life in Chinatown, overcrowding, opium use, gambling, Strip away every shred of context that might explain why these conditions existed, add a generous helping of racist language and sinister insinuation, and publish it under a headline designed to make white readers clutch their pearls and demand action. Action, of course, meant more laws, more raids, more harassment, and more justification for treating Chinese immigrants as something less than human. It was a feedback loop of bigotry. The press created fear, the fear drove policy, the policy created suffering, and the suffering became the next day's headline. The language itself was a weapon. Chinese immigrants weren't described as workers, families, or community members. They were described as a horde, an invasion, a plague. Their neighbourhood wasn't a neighbourhood. It was a warren, a den, a cesspool. The dehumanizing vocabulary served a purpose. It made it easier for readers to support policies that would be obviously cruel if applied to people who were described as, well, people. If the Chinese were a plague, then quarantine made sense. If they were an invasion, then exclusion was self-defense. The words did the heavy lifting, so the laws didn't have to explain themselves. Illustrations were even worse. Newspaper cartoons of the era depicted Chinese immigrants with grotesquely exaggerated features, slanted eyes blown out to absurd proportions, rat-like cues, sinister expressions. They were drawn eating rats, smoking opium, and lurking in shadows, always lurking, because the narrative required Chinese people to be both pathetic and threatening at the same time. These images weren't fringe material. They ran in the city's most respected papers, seen by hundreds of thousands of readers, shaping perceptions that would persist for generations. The few Chinese-language newspapers that operated in Chinatown told a completely different story, of course. Papers like The Oriental, later renamed, and other community publications reported on the real challenges facing the community. Legal battles, employment issues, news from China, community events. They served as a counter-narrative, but one that was invisible to white San Francisco because almost no white readers could read Chinese, and almost no white readers cared to try. The information existed. It simply couldn't penetrate the wall of English-language propaganda that surrounded Chinatown like a siege. What's most insidious about the newspaper coverage of the era is how effective it was. The stories printed in the 1880s didn't just shape contemporary opinion. They created a mythology that endured for decades. The image of Chinatown as a mysterious, dangerous, alien enclave, full of secret tunnels, hidden vice, and inscrutable residents, persisted well into the 20th century. It showed up in movies, novels, and tourist guides long after the laws that created those conditions had been repealed. The press didn't just report the story of 1880s Chinatown. It wrote the story, and then everyone else was forced to live inside it. And the people who actually lived in Chinatown, the laundry workers, the herbalists, the children translating for their parents, never got to tell their version. Not then, anyway. Speaking of those newspapers, let's talk about the tunnels. If you believe the San Francisco press in the 1880s, Chinatown sat on top of a vast underground network of secret passages, hidden chambers, and subterranean lairs where unspeakable things happened in perpetual darkness. The reality? Chinatown did have basements. Some buildings had sub-basements. A few structures connected underground for practical reasons: storage, ventilation, access between buildings on steep hillside terrain. That's it. That was the grand conspiracy. But white journalists and tour guides, sensing an opportunity to sell papers and tickets, transformed ordinary architectural features into a mythological underworld. Chinatown underground tours became a popular attraction, where white visitors paid to be led through basements by guides who spun elaborate tales of hidden opium parlours and mysterious passageways, most of which were entirely fabricated. The tunnel myth was irresistible because it confirmed everything white San Francisco already wanted to believe about its Chinese neighbours, that they were secretive, devious, and operating a parallel civilization hidden from view. The idea that Chinese immigrants might have basements for the same reasons everyone else has basements, storing supplies, staying cool, maximising limited space, was far too boring for the newspapers. Instead, Every cellar became a subterranean den, every connecting doorway between buildings became a secret passage, and every dark room became evidence of hidden wickedness that would make your hair curl if only you knew the truth. The truth, of course, was that you were standing in a root cellar, but that didn't sell papers. The tour guides who led white visitors through Chinatown's underground were masterful storytellers, and some of them were in on the joke. A few were Chinese residents who'd figured out that if white San Francisco wanted to believe in a mysterious underworld, they might as well charge admission. Others were white guides with no connection to the community who invented stories wholesale, pointing at perfectly ordinary basements and whispering about trap doors, hidden rooms and tunnels that stretched for blocks beneath the city streets. One famous guide, known for his dramatic flair, reportedly hired actors to stage scenes in the basements. A fake opium den here, a staged gambling parlour there, to give the tourists their money's worth. It was theatre disguised as tourism, and racism disguised as adventure. The real architectural story of Chinatown's basements was less exciting but genuinely interesting. San Francisco's hilly terrain meant that buildings were often constructed on steep slopes, with entrances at different street levels. A building's ground floor on one street might be a basement on the next street over. This created natural underground connections between structures that had nothing to do with secrecy and everything to do with topography. Some merchants did use these lower levels for storage and as workshops, because space in Chinatown was so scarce that every square foot, including below-ground space, had to earn its keep. There may also have been passages used for quick movement between buildings during moments of danger. When white mobs came through the neighbourhood, having a way to move without stepping onto the street was a practical survival measure, not a criminal enterprise. But none of that matters to a good myth. The tunnel narrative was too perfect, too deliciously scandalous, too useful as propaganda to be corrected by mere facts. It served the dual purpose of entertaining white tourists and reinforcing the racist notion that Chinese immigrants were inherently untrustworthy, always hiding something, always operating beneath the surface. The tunnels became metaphor. Even the ground Chinatown stood on was suspect. And once a myth like that takes root, it doesn't let go easily. Versions of the tunnel story persisted well into the 20th century, showing up in guidebooks, films, and casual conversation. Even today you can find references to Chinatown's mysterious underground in travel writing that should know better. The tunnels that never existed became more famous than the community that actually did, and somewhere in that irony lies one of the most persistent problems with how Chinatown's story has been told. The fiction was always more popular than the truth. One of the most remarkable things about life in 1880s, Chinatown was the invisible financial network that connected a cramped San Francisco neighborhood to villages thousands of miles away in southern China. Almost every man in Chinatown was sending money home. That was the entire point of being here. Endure the racism, survive the work, save every penny, and send it back to a family you might not see for years, if ever. But how do you transfer money across the Pacific Ocean in an era before wire transfers, digital banking, or even reliable international mail? You used a system built entirely on trust. Chinese merchants and brokerages in Chinatown operated informal remittance networks. You'd hand your hard-earned coins to a broker on Sacramento Street, and through a chain of trusted intermediaries stretching from San Francisco to Hong Kong to your home village, the money would arrive. The system worked because it had to. There was no alternative. American banks didn't serve Chinese customers. International postal money orders were unreliable at best and non-existent at worst. And stuffing cash into an envelope and dropping it on a ship was a gamble that would make the fan-tan tables look conservative. So the community built its own financial infrastructure, and it was based on something that no bank could replicate: personal relationships, family connections, and a shared understanding that betraying someone's trust in this network wasn't just a business offence. It was a community-destroying act that would follow you, your name, and your family's reputation across an ocean and back. Here's how it typically worked. You'd approach a trusted merchant or money broker, someone your association or family network had vouched for. You'd hand over your money. Let's say you'd saved $20 after months of working in a laundry, which was a significant sum when your entire monthly expenses might be 10 or 15. The broker would record the transaction, take a small fee, and issue a receipt or letter. On the other end of the chain, a corresponding broker in Hong Kong or Guangzhou would receive instructions, sometimes by letter, sometimes through a trusted courier travelling on one of the regular steamships, and would disburse the equivalent amount to your family's designated contact in the village. The money moved through a web of human connections, and at every link in the chain, the currency of trust was more valuable than the currency of dollars. The amounts were usually small by American standards, but transformative back home. $20 sent from San Francisco could support a family in rural Guangdong for months. It could pay for a child's school fees, repair a roof, buy seed for the next planting season, or settle a debt that had been hanging over the family since before you left. The men who scraped these sums together, working punishing hours, eating as cheaply as possible, denying themselves every comfort, did so with a purpose so clear it was almost religious. The money wasn't for you. It was never for you. It was for them, the family waiting in the village, the family that was the whole reason you were standing in a steam-filled laundry in a country that wanted you gone. The emotional weight of these remittances was enormous. Sending money home wasn't just a financial transaction. It was proof that you were fulfilling your obligation, that the sacrifice was worth something, that your family hadn't sent you across the world for nothing. Failing to send money because of illness, unemployment, or bad luck carried a shame that cut deeper than any insult from a white stranger on the street. You could endure racism, you could endure loneliness, but the thought that your family might be going hungry because you couldn't earn enough in the land of Gold Mountain, that was the weight that kept men awake at night, staring at the ceiling of a room shared with 11 other men who were carrying the exact same burden. Chinese New Year. In 1880s, Chinatown was an act of defiance dressed in red and gold. It was the one time of year when the neighbourhood truly exploded with colour, sound, and unrestrained joy, and it drove the white establishment absolutely crazy. Firecrackers rattled through the streets at all hours, dragon and lion dances wound through the narrow lanes, drums pounding, cymbals crashing, silk costumes rippling in the fog, red banners hung from every balcony. The smell of special holiday foods, dumplings, sticky rice cakes, roast duck, drifted from every kitchen. For a community that spent most of the year keeping its head down, enduring insults and injustice, Chinese New Year was a collective exhale. It was a declaration that no amount of discriminatory legislation could erase who they were, where they came from, or what they celebrated. The preparations began weeks in advance. Debts were settled, or at least aggressively renegotiated, because starting the new year with unpaid obligations was considered terrible luck. Homes and shops were cleaned from floor to ceiling, not just tidied, but scrubbed, swept, and aired out with a thoroughness that would put any modern spring cleaning effort to shame. The cleaning wasn't just about hygiene, it was symbolic, sweeping out the old year's misfortunes to make room for fresh luck. In a neighbourhood that had endured more misfortune than most, the ritual carried extra weight. Out with the bad. Please, let something good come through the door this year. Red was everywhere. Red paper banners inscribed with lucky phrases in gold calligraphy were pasted on door frames. Red envelopes containing small amounts of money were prepared for children and unmarried friends. Red lanterns were hung from balconies and strung across alleys. The colour symbolised good fortune and joy, and for a few days Chinatown transformed from a grey, fog-drenched, embattled neighbourhood into something that looked like it was on fire with happiness. White San Franciscans didn't know what to make of it. Some were genuinely fascinated. Others were irritated by the noise, and the newspapers, predictably, covered Chinese New Year the way they covered everything about Chinatown, with a mixture of condescension, exoticism, and barely concealed contempt, describing the celebrations as peculiar customs and heathen festivities, as though joy required a cultural visa to be considered legitimate. The firecrackers were the most controversial element. Thousands of them, strung together in long red chains, were set off in the streets, producing a continuous, ear-splitting barrage that could last for hours. The explosions were meant to scare away evil spirits a tradition stretching back centuries in China, but they also scared away sleep, horses, and the patience of white neighbours who lodged complaints with city officials. Ordinances were proposed to ban fireworks in Chinatown because apparently the one time per year that Chinese immigrants expressed public joy was exactly one time too many. The lion dance was the celebration's beating heart. Teams of young men, trained for weeks or months, performed inside elaborate silk and papier-mâché lion costumes, leaping, crouching and rolling through the streets to the rhythm of drums, gongs and cymbals. Shopkeepers hung cabbages or red envelopes from their doorways, and the lion would eat the offering, a symbolic exchange of blessings for prosperity. The dance was athletic, beautiful, and unmistakably communal. It required coordination, trust, and practice, all things that Chinatown had in abundance because cooperation wasn't a choice, it was survival. For the men of Chinatown, lonely, overworked, far from home, Chinese New Year was the closest thing to feeling whole that the calendar offered. It was a few days when homesickness softened into something almost bearable, when you could close your eyes and hear the drums and smell the food and just almost believe you were back in your village surrounded by family. You weren't, of course. You were still in San Francisco. The Exclusion Act was still the law. Monday would bring another week of laundry, insults and survival. But for a few bright, loud, beautiful days, Chinatown belonged entirely to itself, and no law on earth could take that away. Here's something the history books don't spend enough time on: the profound, aching loneliness of 1880s Chinatown. The Chinese Exclusion Act and the Page Act of 1875 before it had created something historians call a bachelor society. The vast majority of Chinatown's residents were men, young men, middle-aged men, old men, living without wives, without children, without the ordinary domestic comfort that most human beings build their lives around. Many had left wives and families back in China, expecting to return in a few years with enough money to secure their family's future. But the Exclusion Act slammed that door shut. You couldn't bring your wife over. You couldn't go home and come back. You were stuck, alone, in a country that had legally declared you unwelcome, doing back-breaking work and sleeping in a room full of other lonely men who were all pretending to be fine. The scale of the loneliness is hard to overstate. These weren't young bachelors enjoying their freedom. These were married men separated from their wives by an ocean and a wall of racist legislation. They were fathers who had never held their youngest children, who received the letters describing first steps they didn't witness, and birthdays they couldn't attend. Some hadn't seen their families in 5, 10, 15 years. Some would never see them again. The Exclusion Act didn't just bar immigration. It severed the most fundamental human connections: spousal love, parental bonds, the simple daily warmth of sharing a meal with someone who knows your name and cares whether you come home. The emotional toll was devastating and largely invisible. Chinese men in this era were expected to endure silently. Cultural norms around masculinity, combined with the practical reality that there was no one to confide in and no system to help, even if there were, meant that loneliness was swallowed whole, pushed down, carried in the body like a second set of bones. You didn't talk about it. You didn't acknowledge it. You worked, you sent money home, you wrote letters that said everything was fine, and at night you lay in your bunk and stared at the ceiling and tried not to think about the life you were supposed to be living. The one with your wife's laugh in it. The one with your children running to the door when you came home. Some men found companionship where they could. Deep friendships between men in the same boarding house or the same association chapter became lifelines. Not romantic, but genuinely intimate in the way that shared suffering creates bonds. You knew the man in the bunk above you. You knew his village, his wife's name, how many children he had. You split meals with him. You lent him money when he was short. You sat with him on the rare evening off and said nothing, because sometimes company is enough even when words aren't. The absence of women and families also warped the social fabric of Chinatown in ways that rippled outward for decades. Without the stabilizing influence of domestic life, children to raise, homes to maintain, 1,000 small rituals of family, the neighbourhood developed a transient, impermanent quality. Men lived as though they were always about to leave, even when they knew they couldn't. Rooms were Spartan, possessions were minimal, roots were shallow, not because people didn't want to plant them, but because planting roots in a country that was actively trying to pull you out felt like an act of foolishness rather than faith. Anti-miscegenation laws made the isolation even more complete. In California, marriage between Chinese men and white women was illegal, another law designed to ensure that Chinese immigrants couldn't build families, put down roots, or produce American-born children who might claim citizenship. The legislation was deliberate, strategic, and cruel in a way that's hard to fully grasp until you sit with the human consequences. A generation of men denied not just rights and opportunity, but love. The most basic, universal, irreplaceable human experience, legislated away with a signature. So the men of Chinatown endured. They wrote letters, they sent money, they kept photographs in small trunks under their bunks, a wife's portrait, a child's face, a family home they might never enter again. And they carried their loneliness quietly, the way they carried everything else, with a dignity that the country they lived in had done absolutely nothing to deserve. If the newspapers loved anything about Chinatown, it was the Tong Wars. Headlines screamed about hatchet men and Chinese gang warfare with an enthusiasm that bordered on giddy. And yes, Tong conflicts were real. Tongs were fraternal organisations, some legitimate, some operating in grey areas, and some deeply involved in gambling, protection rackets, and the control of various underground economies. Rivalries between competing Tongs sometimes erupted into violence on Chinatown streets. But what the breathless newspaper coverage consistently failed to mention was context. The Tongs didn't emerge in a vacuum. They arose because Chinese immigrants had been systematically excluded from every legal protection and economic opportunity that other Americans took for granted. When you can't go to the police because the police won't help you, when you can't access courts because the law doesn't recognise your testimony, when your community is crammed into 8 blocks with no legitimate path to power, alternative power structures fill the void. Let's be clear about what Tongs actually were before the newspapers got hold of them and turned them into boogeymen. The word Tong simply means hall or meeting place. Many Tongs were perfectly legitimate fraternal organisations, mutual aid societies that provided services their members couldn't get anywhere else. They offered financial support during illness, helped settle disputes, organised social events, and provided a sense of belonging and brotherhood in a community that was overwhelmingly made up of isolated, lonely men far from home. In function, they weren't so different from the Elks, the Masons, or any of the dozens of fraternal orders that white Americans joined without anyone calling them a criminal syndicate. The difference, of course, was that when white men formed private clubs with secret rituals and hierarchical leadership structures, it was called civic engagement. When Chinese men did the same thing, it was called organised crime. The Tongs that did engage in illegal activity, and some certainly did, were products of the same conditions that created everything else in Chinatown. Exclusion. When you deny an entire population access to legitimate economic channels, some members of that population will create illegitimate ones. Gambling operations, which as we've already discussed were treated as criminal enterprises only when Chinese people ran them, generated revenue that flowed through Tong-controlled networks. Protection rackets emerged because the police offered no protection, and the control of these enterprises, concentrated within a few square blocks with no external oversight, inevitably led to competition, and competition sometimes turned violent. This is not a uniquely Chinese phenomenon. It is what happens in every marginalised community that is cut off from mainstream institutions. The Irish gangs of New York, the Italian organisations that would later dominate organised crime in America, and the Jewish crime networks of the Lower East Side all emerge from identical conditions: poverty, exclusion, and the systematic denial of legitimate opportunity. But when white ethnic groups formed criminal organisations, historians eventually wrote nuanced accounts exploring the social conditions that produced them. Chinese Tongs got no such treatment. They got headlines. The so-called hatchet men, or bu hao doi, were enforcers for the more aggressive Tongs. The name came from the weapon of choice, small hatchets that could be concealed under a jacket and deployed quickly in the narrow alleys of Chinatown. The violence was real, and it was sometimes deadly. Rivalries over gambling territory, business disputes, and personal vendettas led to ambushes, street fights, and the occasional assassination that sent the newspapers into rapturous fits of coverage. Each incident was reported with the kind of breathless excitement usually reserved for natural disasters, confirming every racist assumption white readers already held about the inherent danger of Chinese people. The articles rarely mentioned that most of the violence was directed at other Tong members, not at the general public, and certainly not at white San Franciscans, who were at far greater statistical risk of being robbed, stabbed, or shot in the Barbary Coast district than they ever were walking through Chinatown. What the newspapers never reported was scale. The actual number of violent incidents in Chinatown was remarkably small compared to the violence in other parts of San Francisco, a city that was, let's remember, one of the roughest in America during this era. The Barbary Coast district, just blocks from Chinatown, was infamous for murders, robberies, shanghaiing, and violence on a scale that dwarfed anything the Tongs ever produced. Sailors were drugged, robbed, and pressed into involuntary service on outbound ships. Bar fights ended in stabbings with a regularity that barely made the papers anymore. But crimes in the Barbary Coast were committed by white people, which made them unfortunate incidents, rather than evidence of racial degeneracy. The double standard was so consistent it was almost impressive in its shamelessness. The Tong Wars also had a self-correcting mechanism that the newspapers never mentioned. The Tongs themselves wanted peace. Violence was bad for business. Dead members couldn't pay dues. Disrupted gambling operations didn't generate revenue. Street fights drew police attention, which drew newspaper attention, which drew political attention, which led to raids and crackdowns that hurt everyone. The Six Companies and the more established Tongs frequently mediated between warring factions, negotiating truces and settlements that kept the peace for months or years at a time. Elaborate peace negotiations, complete with formal banquets, signed agreements, and community witnesses, were a regular feature of Tong relations. When violence did erupt, it was usually brief, contained, and resolved internally, a far cry from the apocalyptic gang warfare the newspapers described. But accuracy was never the point. The Tong Wars gave white San Francisco exactly what it wanted. A reason to fear Chinatown, a justification for continued persecution, and a story exciting enough to sell a lot of papers. The men who actually lived in Chinatown, the laundry workers, the cooks, the herbalists who had nothing to do with any Tong, paid the price for every lurid headline. Because in the eyes of a city that had already decided they were dangerous, one hatchet fight was enough to condemn an entire people. And condemn them they did, over and over again, in ink that dried faster than the blood it was written about. For all the injustice heaped on Chinese immigrants, they didn't just take it quietly. Some of the most important civil rights battles in American legal history were fought by Chinese residents of San Francisco, who had every reason to give up but didn't. The most famous case was Yik Wu versus Hopkins in 1886. Yik Wu was a laundry operator who had been running his business in San Francisco for over 20 years. When the city passed an ordinance requiring all laundries in wooden buildings to obtain a permit, every single white applicant was approved, and every single Chinese applicant was denied, every one. The discrimination wasn't even subtle, it was almost comically blatant. Yik Wu refused to close his laundry, was arrested, and fought his case all the way to the United States Supreme Court. The ordinance in question was a masterpiece of racist legislation disguised as public safety regulation. On its face, the law sounded reasonable enough. Laundries operating in wooden buildings needed a permit from the Board of Supervisors to continue operating, ostensibly to reduce fire risk. San Francisco was a city built largely of wood, and fire was a legitimate concern. The Great Fire of 1851 had already demonstrated what happened when flames got loose in a city of timber. But the application of the law revealed its true purpose with the subtlety of a sledgehammer. Of roughly 200 Chinese laundry operators who applied for permits, not a single one was approved. Meanwhile, nearly all white applicants operating under identical conditions, same wooden buildings, same fire risk, same neighbourhoods, received their permits without difficulty. The law was race-neutral on paper and nakedly racist in practice, which was exactly how San Francisco preferred its discrimination. Technically legal, practically devastating, and deniable if anyone important asked questions. Yik Wo and a fellow laundry operator named Wo Lee both refused to shut down and were arrested. Their cases were combined and appealed through the California courts, where they lost, because the California courts in the 1880s were not exactly bastions of racial justice. The state judiciary had already demonstrated its hostility to Chinese rights in case after case, and expecting a fair hearing. From judges who shared the same prejudices as the legislators who wrote the discriminatory laws was optimistic to the point of delusion. But the case didn't stop there. With funding from the Chinese community, organised through the 6 companies and individual contributions from laundry operators who understood that this fight was bigger than any one business, and with representation by skilled attorneys who recognised the constitutional implications, the case reached the Supreme Court of the United States in 1886. And in a decision that still echoes through American law today, the court ruled unanimously in Yik Wo's favour. The ruling was groundbreaking in ways that extended far beyond laundry permits. The court held that a law that is fair on its face, but administered with an evil eye and an unequal hand, violates the 14th Amendment's guarantee of equal protection under the law. It was the first time the Supreme Court had explicitly stated that the 14th Amendment applied not just to citizens, but to all persons within the jurisdiction of the United States, including Chinese immigrants who were legally barred from becoming citizens. Read that again, because it matters. The highest court in the land declared that even people the government refused to grant citizenship were still entitled to equal treatment under the law. The decision established the principle that discriminatory enforcement of a neutral law is just as unconstitutional as a discriminatory law itself, a legal concept that would become a cornerstone of civil rights litigation for the next century and beyond, cited in cases involving African Americans, women, immigrants of all nationalities, and every marginalized group that ever stood before a court and said, "This law isn't being applied fairly." Yik Wo versus Hopkins didn't fix everything. It didn't end anti-Chinese discrimination in San Francisco. It didn't repeal the Exclusion Act. It didn't stop the harassment, the raids, or the daily indignities that Chinese immigrants endured. The city simply found new ways to discriminate, because when one tool is taken away, bigotry picks up another. New ordinances were drafted, new enforcement strategies were devised, and the machinery of exclusion ground on with barely a pause. But the case mattered enormously. It mattered because it established a legal precedent that would be cited in civil rights cases for generations. It mattered because it proved that the American legal system, for all its flaws and hypocrisies, could occasionally be bent toward justice when someone was brave enough to push. And it mattered because a laundry operator named Yik Wo, a man who washed other people's shirts for a living in a country that didn't consider him worthy of citizenship, stood up and said no. Not quietly, not politely, but in the highest court in the land, with the full weight of a hostile legal system pressing down on him, and he won. The Chinese community's willingness to fight in court wasn't limited to Yik Wo. Throughout the 1880s and beyond, Chinese immigrants and their legal advocates challenged discriminatory laws, deportation orders, and civil rights violations with a persistence that was remarkable, given how thoroughly the system was stacked against them. They lost far more often than they won, but they kept filing, kept appealing, and kept showing up, because the alternative, accepting injustice without protest, was something this community, forged in the fire of exclusion and tempered by a stubbornness that no legislature could outlaw, had never been willing to do. And every case they filed, win or lose, chipped away at the wall, slowly, imperceptibly, but relentlessly. The wall is still standing in many ways, but it's shorter than it used to be, and the people of 1880s Chinatown are part of the reason why. San Francisco's Board of Health had a complicated relationship with Chinatown, and by complicated, I mean they used public health as a weapon of racial persecution. City health inspectors descended on Chinatown with a regularity and enthusiasm they never applied to any other neighbourhood. They cited overcrowding, poor sanitation, and disease risk, all real problems to be fair, but problems that existed precisely because the city had forced Chinese immigrants into an impossibly small area, denied them basic municipal services, and allowed white landlords to charge outrageous rents for buildings that would have been condemned in any other district. It was a perfect cycle of cruelty. Create the conditions for squalor, then punish people for living in squalor. Health inspections became a tool of harassment, a pretext for raids, and occasionally a justification for proposals to demolish Chinatown entirely and relocate its residents to the outskirts of the city, where they could be even more thoroughly forgotten. The inspectors arrived with clipboards, white coats, and barely concealed disgust. They noted the overcrowded rooms, the shared privies, the inadequate drainage, the laundry lines strung across alleys, and the persistent dampness that came from packing too many people into too little space with insufficient ventilation. They recorded the number of residents per room with the same detached precision a farmer might use to count livestock, and the comparison wasn't entirely accidental, because the reports were written in a language that treated Chinese residents as something closer to an infestation than a community. They described Chinatown as a plague spot, a menace to public health, a festering sore on the body of the city. The reports were thorough, professional, and entirely devoid of any acknowledgement that the conditions they documented were the direct result of policies the city itself had created and enforced. The inspectors examined the symptoms and never once glanced at the cause, which was standing right behind them, wearing a city badge. Let's spell that out with the clarity it deserves, because the circular logic of this persecution needs to be laid bare. Chinatown was overcrowded because Chinese immigrants were not allowed to live anywhere else. Discriminatory housing covenants, hostile landlords, and the constant threat of violence outside Chinatown's borders meant that the entire Chinese population of San Francisco was compressed into a space that couldn't reasonably hold a quarter of them. The housing was substandard because white landlords had no incentive to maintain buildings whose tenants had no legal recourse, no alternative housing options, and no political voice. Why fix a leaking roof when the tenant can't complain to anyone who matters? Sanitation was poor because the city provided minimal municipal services to the neighbourhood, fewer garbage collections, less sewer maintenance, and virtually no investment in infrastructure improvements. The streets outside Chinatown got paved. The streets inside Chinatown got ignored. And disease was more common because overcrowding, poor nutrition, inadequate ventilation, and lack of access to medical care are the textbook conditions for illness, conditions that the city's own policies had deliberately, systematically, and unapologetically created. Blaming Chinese immigrants for the public health consequences of their own persecution was like pushing someone into a river, refusing to throw them a rope, and then filing a complaint about how wet they were. The health inspections also served as convenient cover for more aggressive actions. Raids on Chinatown businesses were sometimes conducted under the pretense of health enforcement, with inspectors accompanied by police officers who used the opportunity to search for evidence of gambling, opium use, or immigration violations. A health inspection could easily become an arrest operation, and the residents of Chinatown knew it. The knock of a health inspector on your door wasn't a public service. It was a threat wearing a lab coat. You opened the door and smiled and cooperated because the alternative was worse. But everyone in the room understood the real purpose of the visit, and it had nothing to do with your well-being. The most extreme proposals went further than inspection. Throughout the 1880s, various city officials, civic organizations, and newspaper editorial boards proposed relocating Chinatown entirely, moving its residents to a distant, undeveloped area far from the city centre. Hunters Point and other remote locations were suggested as suitable dumping grounds for a population that the city considered both indispensable as a labour force and intolerable as neighbours. The arguments were always framed in the language of public health and urban improvement. Chinatown was a blight, they said, a danger to surrounding neighbourhoods, an obstacle to the city's progress and prosperity. What they meant, of course, was that some of the most valuable real estate in the heart of a booming city was being occupied by people they considered disposable, and they wanted it back. These proposals were debated seriously in city council meetings, published with editorial endorsement in major newspapers, and supported by significant portions of the white population who saw nothing wrong with forcibly uprooting thousands of people from their homes and businesses. They failed, repeatedly, but not because of any groundswell of sympathy for Chinese residents. They failed because of legal challenges mounted by the 6 companies, diplomatic pressure from the Chinese government, and the practical difficulty of forcibly relocating a deeply established community, obstacles that delayed the plans long enough for circumstances to change. The irony, thick enough to choke on, is that Chinatown, despite every disadvantage the city imposed on it, managed to maintain a degree of community health and organisation that was remarkable under the circumstances. Community organisations coordinated clean-up efforts and sanitation campaigns. Herbalists and traditional medicine practitioners provided care that was often more attentive and less dangerous than what was available at city hospitals. Residents adapted to their conditions with the same fierce ingenuity they applied to everything else, finding ways to keep living spaces as clean as overcrowding would allow. But none of that mattered to the inspectors or the politicians who dispatched them. The narrative was set before the first clipboard was opened. Chinatown was dirty, Chinatown was dangerous, and the Chinese were to blame. The fact that the real blame belonged to the city officials holding the clipboards was a detail no one in power was interested in examining, because examining it would have meant admitting that the problem wasn't Chinatown. The problem was San Francisco. When the sun went down in 1880s Chinatown, the neighbourhood didn't just lock its doors, it posted guards. Not officially, not with badges and uniforms, but through an informal network of night watchmen who patrolled the streets, watched the alley entrances, and kept an eye out for the kinds of trouble that came looking for Chinatown after dark. And trouble came often. White mobs, fueled by alcohol and racism, would sometimes surge into the neighbourhood looking to break windows, start fights, or worse. Arson was a constant threat. A match and a wooden building were all it took to destroy a family's livelihood and home in minutes. Individual Chinese residents walking alone outside Chinatown after dark risked being assaulted or robbed with virtually no recourse, since police either ignored crimes against Chinese victims or blamed them for being in the wrong place at the wrong time, which in the eyes of 1880s San Francisco meant being Chinese anywhere, at any time. So the community organised its own protection, quietly, efficiently, and out of sheer necessity. Because waiting for justice from a system that had never provided it was a luxury no one could afford. The night watchmen were typically young men, trusted by the community associations and the 6 companies, who took shifts walking the perimeter streets and monitoring the alley entrances that served as Chinatown's informal borders. They carried no weapons beyond what any resident might reasonably have, a walking stick perhaps, or the kind of small blade that any working man kept on his person for daily tasks. Their primary tool wasn't force, it was alertness. They knew the neighbourhood's rhythms the way a sailor knows the tides, which footsteps belonged and which didn't, which shadows were residents heading home from late shifts at the laundry, and which were strangers moving with the deliberate liquid pace of people looking for something to break. They knew which doors should be closed at midnight, and which merchants kept late hours. They knew the sound of a normal conversation drifting from a tea house, and the sound of an argument escalating towards something worse. When trouble was spotted, the alarms spread quickly through a network of shouts, sharp whistles, knocks on doors, and runners who carried warnings from block to block faster than any official communication system could have managed. The threats they guarded against were real, varied, and relentless. Anti-Chinese violence in San Francisco during this era wasn't occasional or isolated. It was persistent, organised, and sometimes coordinated by the same civic leaders who sat in city council meetings during the day looking respectable. The infamous anti-Chinese riots of 1877, when mobs rampaged through Chinatown for days, burning laundries, destroying property, and beating anyone they caught on the street, were still seared into the community's collective memory barely a decade later. That violence hadn't been some spontaneous eruption. It had been stoked by politicians and labour leaders who used anti-Chinese rhetoric as fuel and then expressed shock when it caught fire. The police, when they showed up at all during those riots, were as likely to arrest Chinese victims defending their property as they were to stop white attackers destroying it. The lesson was learned, deeply and permanently. Chinatown was on its own. This reality shaped everything about how the neighbourhood operated after dark. Streets that bustled with commerce, conversation, and the clattering energy of a compressed community during the day grew quiet and watchful at night. Doors were bolted from inside. Windows were shuttered with wooden boards. The few people still moving through the lanes walked quickly and purposefully, aware that lingering invited attention from both external threats and the watchmen themselves, who took their responsibilities seriously enough to question anyone who didn't seem to belong. Merchants locked their cash boxes inside hidden compartments. Families who lived above their shops gathered children close and listened to the sounds of the street below with the practiced ear of people who had learned to distinguish between ordinary noise and the prelude to disaster. The night watchmen also served a function that went beyond physical protection. Their presence was a statement of community solidarity, a visible declaration that Chinatown took care of its own because nobody else would, and nobody else had ever pretended to try. Young men who served as watchmen earned respect and trust within the community, and the role carried a sense of duty that connected to deeper cultural values about loyalty, service, and collective responsibility that stretched back centuries before any of them had set foot on a steamship. You weren't just guarding buildings and alleyways, you were guarding the community's right to exist in a city that questioned that right with every law it passed and every mob it failed to stop. There was also a psychological dimension to the watchman's role that shouldn't be underestimated. Knowing that someone was out there, walking the streets, watching the borders, allowed the rest of the community to sleep. Not well, perhaps, and never without one ear tuned to the sounds outside, but to sleep nonetheless. In a neighbourhood where anxiety was the baseline emotional state, and hypervigilance was a survival skill, the watchmen absorbed some of that burden. They carried the community's fear on their shoulders so that the laundry worker, who had to be up at 4 a.m, could close his eyes for a few hours without wondering whether tonight was the night the mobs came back. It wasn't a perfect system. Nothing in Chinatown was perfect, but it was theirs, built from necessity and maintained by commitment, and it worked well enough to keep the neighbourhood intact through years of hostility that would have broken a less determined community. The fact that Chinatown needed its own informal security force is, in itself, one of the most damning indictments of the city that surrounded it. A neighbourhood that pays taxes, contributes labour, and asks for nothing more than the right to live in peace should not need to post guards against its own neighbours and its own police force. But 1880s, San Francisco was not a city interested in fairness, and the Chinese community had learned, through bitter and repeated experience, that waiting for protection from the authorities was not a strategy. It was a death wish. So they protected themselves, one watchful night at a time, standing in the fog and the dark at the mouths of alleys, listening to the city breathe, making sure that when morning came, Chinatown was still there, still stubborn, still standing, still refusing to disappear. It always was, and that, more than any legal victory or economic achievement, is a testament to the people who kept watch while everyone else slept. Perhaps the most human thing about 1880s Chinatown was the letters, thousands of them, written in careful brushstrokes on thin paper, folded, sealed, and sent on ships back to Guangdong province. In these letters, men who worked 18-hour days in steam-filled laundries wrote about how well things were going. Men who hadn't eaten a proper meal in weeks described the abundance of Gold Mountain. Men who were desperately lonely, racially persecuted, and exhausted beyond measure wrote cheerful updates about a life that bore almost no resemblance to the one they were actually living. They lied, and they did it out of love, because back in the village, a family was depending on the idea that the sacrifice was worth it, that the money being sent home was earned in dignity, that the son or husband or father across the ocean was thriving. To tell the truth would have been to admit that the dream was broken, and some truths are too heavy to put in a letter. The letter-writing process itself was a ritual. performed with a solemnity that elevated it above mere correspondence into something closer to prayer. For men who were literate, it was a solitary act, performed late at night after the day's work was done, hunched over a small table or the flat lid of a wooden trunk, grinding ink on a stone and dipping a brush with the same deliberate care they might have used back home writing to an ancestor during a festival. The brush moved slowly. The characters were formed with intention. Every stroke was a bridge across the Pacific, a thin line of ink connecting a cramped room in San Francisco to a courtyard in a village where someone was waiting for exactly this. Proof that you were alive, proof that you hadn't forgotten, proof that the ocean between you was not permanent. For men who couldn't write, and many couldn't since formal education in rural Guangdong was a luxury that poverty didn't permit, the process required a letter writer, a literate man in the community who served as a professional scribe for a small fee. You'd sit with him in his tiny office or at a corner table in a tea house and dictate your letter, which meant that your most private thoughts, your deepest fears, your most tender expressions of love for a wife you hadn't touched in years, were spoken aloud to a relative stranger who wrote them down in neat columns of characters, while you watched and wondered if the words on the page captured even a fraction of what you actually felt. The intimacy of it was excruciating. The necessity of it was unavoidable. And the letter writers, those quiet professionals of private grief, performed their work with a discretion and gentleness that made them some of the most trusted people in the neighbourhood. The lies in the letters weren't malicious. They were protective, deliberate, and in their own way, heroic. You didn't write home and say, "I sleep in a room with 12 men, and the ceiling leaks, and a white man spat on me in the street today, and I haven't had a hot bath in 3 weeks, and sometimes I forget what your face looks like, and it terrifies me." You wrote, "Business is steady, and I am in good health, and I hope you received the money I sent last month. Please give my regards to Mother and tell the children to study hard." You didn't describe the rats in the boarding house, the cough that had settled in your chest and wouldn't leave, the law that had just been passed making it even harder for you to exist in this country, or the nights when the loneliness was so thick it felt like something physical sitting on your chest. You described the weather, asked about the children's studies, reminded your wife to repair the roof before the rainy season, inquired about the neighbour's new baby, and closed with the same promise you always made. "I will come home soon," even when you knew, somewhere in the part of your mind you didn't let the letter writer see and didn't let yourself examine too closely in the dark hours before sleep, that soon might mean years. That soon might mean never. The letters that came back from China carried their own weight, their own lies, and their own fragile architecture of hope. A wife's handwriting, or more often, a wife's words as transcribed by the village letter writer, would describe the harvest, the children's growth, the health of elderly parents, and the state of the house. She might mention that the money arrived safely, that the roof was repaired, that the elder son was doing well in his studies. She probably didn't mention the night she spent wondering if her husband was dead, or the whispers from neighbours about women whose husbands left for Gold Mountain and never returned, or the creeping fear that the money would stop coming and she would have no way to know why. These letters were read and reread until the paper softened to cloth, until the ink faded and the creases wore through. They were carried in pockets against the chest, stored under pillows, and sometimes shared with roommates who understood their value because they had identical letters of their own, identically worn, identically precious. A good letter from home could sustain a man for weeks, could light something in his chest that made the next day bearable. A bad one, news of illness, a failed crop, a death in the family, a child who no longer remembered his father's voice, could break him in ways that no amount of racist legislation, no 18-hour workday, no mob in the street ever could. Because the hardship of Chinatown was endurable, as long as the reason for enduring it remained intact. The family, the village, the idea that all of this suffering had a purpose that would outlast the suffering itself. Some letters never arrived. Ships were delayed by storms. Mail was lost in transit, swallowed by the vast indifferent Pacific. Addresses changed as families moved or as villages reorganized. Carriers were unreliable. And in the cruelest cases, The person you were writing to had died weeks or months before your letter reached the village, which meant that somewhere in the South China Sea, your words of love and reassurance and gentle lies were crossing paths with news of loss that was heading toward you at the same speed. 2 ships passing in opposite directions on the same dark water, each carrying a message that would arrive too late to matter. The men of Chinatown lived with this uncertainty constantly, as a background hum of anxiety that never fully subsided. Every letter sent was an act of faith launched into a void. Every letter received was a small miracle that confirmed the continued existence of a world you could no longer see or touch. And the silence between letters, the weeks and months of waiting, of checking with the mail broker, of telling yourself that no news is good news while your stomach told you otherwise, was its own special form of torture, quieter than racism and lonelier than a shared bunk, but just as real and just as capable of hollowing a man out from the inside. The letters are mostly gone now. Paper doesn't survive the way stone does. The ink fades, the pages crumble, the trunks that held them are scattered or destroyed, but the impulse behind them, the fierce, stubborn, heartbreaking determination to stay connected to the people you love across impossible distances and through impossible circumstances, is as human as anything that has ever been written down in any language, in any century, on any continent. Every lie and every letter was an act of love. Every careful omission was a shield held up between a family's hope and the ugly truth of Gold Mountain. And every man who sat down after an 18-hour day, with cracked hands and aching shoulders and eyes that could barely focus, to grind ink and pick up a brush and write words he knew weren't true, that man was doing the bravest thing he did all week. He was pretending, for the sake of someone who needed to believe it, that everything was going to be all right. And maybe, in writing it down, he almost believed it himself. Almost. Just enough to get through one more night. So tonight, as you lie in your clean bed with the lights low and the world quiet around you, maybe take a moment to think about them. The men of 1880s Chinatown, the ones who crossed an ocean on a promise that turned out to be a lie wrapped in gold paper, and who built a world anyway with whatever they had left after the lie was unwrapped. They didn't have much. A few square blocks of a city that wished they'd vanish. A shared bunk in a room that leaked when it rained and sweltered when it didn't. A wok that could turn cabbage and rice into something that tasted like home if you closed your eyes hard enough. A wash tub that ate the skin off their hands 6 days a week. A letter from across the ocean that was already 3 months old by the time it reached their fingers. The ink slightly smudged. The paper soft from being folded and unfolded by someone they loved. They had laws stacked against them like bricks in a wall that grew taller every year. They had newspapers printing lies about them and calling it journalism. They had mobs in the street and police who looked the other way, and politicians who built careers on the promise of making them disappear. They had a government that had decided, officially and on the record and with a ceremonial pen, that they didn't belong in the country they were helping to build. And still they stayed. They opened shops on streets that didn't want them, and served customers who wouldn't shake their hands. They raised children in a neighbourhood without enough mothers, without enough schools, without enough of anything except determination, and the stubborn belief that the next generation deserved better than this one got. They sent money across an ocean through a network built on nothing but trust, handshake agreements, and the unshakable understanding that family comes first, always, no matter how many miles of cold water sit between you and the people you love. They celebrated New Year with firecrackers and lion dances and red banners hung from every balcony, while a city tried to legislate their joy out of existence. They fought back in courtrooms where the law itself was the enemy, armed with nothing but a legal argument and the audacity to believe that the Constitution might actually mean what it said. And they won cases that changed the meaning of justice in America forever. They prayed in temples tucked above narrow staircases, burning incense and shaking fortune sticks, and asking small gods for big favours. And they kept the faith even when the answers didn't come, and the incense burned down to ash, and the fortune sticks said nothing they wanted to hear. They weren't perfect. No community is. They had their flaws, their conflicts, their moments of cruelty and failure, because they were human beings, not monuments. but they were extraordinary in the way that ordinary people become extraordinary when the world leaves them no other choice but to be remarkable or be erased. They adapted when the rules changed. They improvised when the resources ran out. They endured when endurance was the only option left on the table, and the table was about to be taken away too. They turned 8 blocks of hostility into a home that hummed with life and commerce and prayer, and the smell of roasting duck and the sound of Cantonese echoing off wooden balconies. They turned dirty laundry, literally other people's dirty laundry, into a livelihood, and they did it with a quiet pride that no amount of mockery could diminish. They turned loneliness into letters and letters into love, sent across the widest ocean on the planet to land in the hands of someone who needed to believe that the sacrifice was worth it. And maybe it was. Maybe the proof is right here, in the fact that we're still telling their story, still saying their names into the dark, still refusing to let them be forgotten. Because history isn't just about empires and armies, and the people whose names end up carved in marble. It's about the nameless ones too, the ones who never got a statue or a holiday or even a thank you, the men grinding ink at midnight, writing lies to protect the people they loved, the herbalists measuring ginseng root by candlelight for a patient who couldn't see a real doctor because America had decided Chinese lungs didn't deserve the same air, the night watchman standing in the San Francisco fog at 3 a.m. watching the mouth of an alley, making sure that when the sun came up, Chinatown was still there, still stubborn, still breathing, still alive, still refusing with every heartbeat to be the thing the newspapers said it was. So tonight, as sleep pulls you gently under and the world outside your window goes soft and quiet, maybe whisper a thank you to those who endured what no one should have to and built something beautiful from it anyway, something lasting, something that fed a country's stomach before that country fed their dignity, something that won legal battles the country didn't even know it needed to win, something that proved, in the quietest and most stubborn way possible, that you can take almost everything from a person, their rights, their freedom, their family, their name, and still not take the thing that matters most, the part that keeps going, the part that writes the letter, the part that lights the incense, the part that stands watch in the dark. Because if they could survive 1880 San Francisco with nothing but courage, community, a good walk, and the unbreakable belief that the people waiting on the other side of the ocean were worth every single miserable day of it, then you can probably survive tomorrow too. Good night, sleep well, and remember, you're lying in comfort tonight because someone somewhere, a long time ago, refused to give up, even when giving up was the only thing that made sense, especially then.